Gettysburg Museum of History Studios.
You're listening to Addressing Gettysburg.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of Addressing Gettysburg. And today we've got, I think, an interesting topic, a special topic, if you will. You know, if you've followed the show long enough, you know that we don't just stick to troop movements on the battlefield and, you know, all of that stuff. I mean, as interesting as that is, that's kind of the thing that gets our attention. But there's so much more that goes into making the battle what it was. And one of those things is weather. And if you've ever visited Gettysburg in July or June or August or during the summer months, you know how hot it can get. But you and I and everybody else have an automobile with air conditioning to escape into, a hotel with a pool to cool off at the end of the day, a restaurant with ice cold beer to go to for dinner with air conditioning inside. None of these things existed for the soldiers who fought here at Gettysburg in 1863. These guys must have stunk from all of the sweating and grime and heat that they endured. And with us today are two guys who have been studying weather, perhaps obsessively, but to our benefit. It's Jeffrey Harding and Jon Nese. They are here to talk about their latest book, The Weather Gods Curse the Gettysburg Campaign. And they join me via Zoom. Welcome, gentlemen.
Glad to be here.
Great to be here, Matt.
Thank you.
It's great to have you guys. All right, so this is very interesting. I watched your talk from the Foundation's Sacred Trust Talks last year, and I found it so riveting. People might be saying, it's the weather. What the hell's so riveting about the weather? But it's so. I wouldn't care about it if it wasn't surrounding the Battle of Gettysburg, the Gettysburg Campaign. It's not just the battle, it's the campaign. And what's fascinating to me, the first thing that really got me, and it always gets me, and I think I call this modern day arrogance, that they really kept records of the weather beyond temperature and is the sun out or is it cloudy? You know what I mean? You don't think of that, but you guys go into the Smithsonian's weather study program and the Naval Yard and everything. Kind of, if you can, paint a picture of the background of the study of weather in 1863 in the United States.
Yeah, Jon, take that.
Well, I want to first say, Matt, that I hope one day my students are as riveted to my lecture presentation. I really appreciate that.
Sure.
The state of weather in the United States in the years leading up to the Civil War. The Smithsonian had opened in 1850-ish, and to some extent, there were some weather observers in the U.S. prior to the Smithsonian, but most of those were absorbed more or less under the heading of the Smithsonian during the 1850s. And so pre-Civil War, there was actually, compared to modern day weather networks, there weren't that many, but there were dozens of observers scattered across mainly the eastern United States. And then when the Civil War began, most of the observers in the South stopped observing, or they stopped reporting. But in the North, you still had some observers in places such as Gettysburg and Harrisburg, Washington, D.C., Frederick, Maryland, for example, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, where the records are available. And thanks to a lot of work by Jeff, and I'll let him sort of finish the story, we were able to unearth as much data as we could possibly find to kind of rebuild what was going on during the Gettysburg Campaign.
So it's kind of like finding a Nielsen family today. Like they still exist, but not everybody does it because not everybody watches regular TV anymore. Is that kind of the way it was when the South stopped keeping records?
Sure. We'll go with that.
It's probably not apples to apples, but okay. So Jeff, go ahead. How'd you find all this stuff?
Yeah, so I was really fortunate. I started out really, Matt, because as a guide, you're going to get asked about the weather, and I had understood that we had a weather observer in Gettysburg. Didn't know his tie to the Smithsonian at the time. Knew that he, of course, was one of the founding instructors at college, Pennsylvania College. We know as Gettysburg College, and was very good observer. And we knew because of him, for instance, on the third day of the battle, 87 degrees at 2 p.m. Mm-hmm. So I would tell people that's the best we have. Three times a day, Professor Jacobs would observe the weather. But it always ate at me that I couldn't give him more information. And I wanted to go and find his source documents. The best that most people were relying upon was an article in 1885, I believe it was, written by his son, based upon his dad's records, which laid out the weather a couple days before the battle, during the battle, and a couple days after. But I wanted to see the source documents, so started hunting. And fortunately, like I said, was blessed to find it through an individual down at a NOAA location down in Asheville, the NCEI. Boy, you mentioned this to me, Matt. It was so cool to see it in the book. I mean, it put the hair up on my neck. There it is, the real McCoy, right?
Right.
And at that time, I wasn't aware of anyone that had seen these things. Now, it turns out John, being the astute professor that he is, had seen these and done reports based upon them. There was a meteorologist and weather historian, David Ludlam, in the early 1960s, really wrote what I think John would agree, a groundbreaking article analysis of the weather during the battle. And he had seen them, obviously. And Robert K. Crick had seen these because he published the book, Civil War Weather in Virginia. And he wasn't specifically, of course, focusing on Gettysburg. He was looking at weather records from Georgetown, D.C., if you will, and using that to extrapolate for Virginia. Later on, you'll see some in Ken No. That comes a little after when I had originally found these and some others. But bottom line is, there they are. And will it give me more than we already know? And that's when I turned to John, and we always kid because, I made a phone call, and God bless him, he answered it. And here we are, John, almost 10 years later. Yeah. We're still on the subject.
You still have yet to meet each other where the other one lives, right? You refuse to go visit.
No, can't do that. Too far. But I just called to thank him because he had co-authored another book where they talked a little bit about Jacobs. That helped me get started, and I wanted to thank him. And then I said, John, I've got these records. I don't know, one end of the thermometer from another. How about taking a look at this and let me know if there's anything that'll give us heat index? Because that's what I really wanted to get at. What did it really feel like to the soldiers? And so John took a look and he said, Jeff, this is great, and I've seen these and everything, but you need more. You need something. Here comes the curveball. You need wet bulb temperature. And I said, okay, I knew you were going to say that, John. But yeah.
Well, let's slow down a little bit here.
Yeah.
Let's slow down. Back to Matt's original point, which is that there were observers, but there weren't many. The observers that we knew of observed the weather 3 times a day.
Yes.
And they mostly did have more than a thermometer. Matt, they had other instruments, such as a barometer, which measures pressure. Mm-hmm. And they would have wind direction and speed measuring instruments. And one of the great parts of doing this project was there was a special observer in Washington, D.C. at the Naval Observatory, a place where you would expect the measurements to be really good. And they were measuring the weather 8 times a day.
Wow.
And they also had special thermometers at the Naval Observatory that most of the other observers didn't have. And those special thermometers enabled them to know what the highest and lowest temperatures were every day. And as you know, Matt, if you've watched a weather report on television, they always tell you what the high and the low were, and that's important. And
well, let me stop you there, if I may.
Yeah.
Why do you need special thermometers to tell you the high and the low? Couldn't one do both as the temperature changes?
Well, if you were continuously looking at the thermometer the entire day, You could watch when it reaches its highest level, and you could watch when it reaches its lowest level. But these observers were only looking at the thermometers 8 times a day.
Right.
There are special thermometers when the mercury goes up in the tube. There are special thermometers that will capture the highest value and then capture the lowest value, and those are specially made thermometers that not hardly anyone has.
So it almost records the highest point it hit, and then you can go and see. That is so cool. Oh man. So, okay. Well, I don't want to get into
that's the critical thing too, Matt, because Jacobs, he wasn't even doing 8 times a day. He was just doing 3 times a day.
Right.
But to tell somebody 87 degrees in the shade at 2 p.m., that's nice. But how hot did it get?
Well,
and again, what was the heat index?
And you said in the shade at 2 p.m., which that's important too, because
and it's temperatures or shade measurements, and we can get into all this.
But before we do, let John, if you can continue with the instruments that they use, because you guys go into all these things, and it's really interesting.
So, one instrument that Jacobs did not have, that many of the other observers did have, was a special thermometer called a wet bulb thermometer. And I won't get into the details of how it works, but the bottom line is, with that instrument, you can come up with a measure of humidity, how humid it is.
Yeah.
And if you know that and you know the actual air temperature, you can compute the heat index, which is sort of the feels like temperature that blends the heat and the humidity. And that's what Jeff was after. And Jacobs didn't have that thermometer. Why he didn't have it, we don't know. But he didn't have it. So what we did was we found some locations around Gettysburg where the observers had that special thermometer, where you could compute the humidity, and then we used that data to build the picture in Gettysburg.
And like, how far away are we talking? Frederick, Harrisburg?
Well, Harrisburg is about 35 miles from Gettysburg. The naval, Washington, D.C., of course, is much far. I don't have the distance memorized, but
about 70.
About 70. But when the armies were moving north through Virginia to get to Gettysburg, they weren't that far from Washington, D.C. And you can make meteorological arguments about extrapolating certain bits of information based on the overall weather pattern. And I was able to tap into a resource that's available to anyone who wants to use it online. You pay for with your tax dollars from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. It's a website where you can rebuild weather maps from the past.
Yes.
And so we were able to rebuild some weather maps from that period in 1863 that allowed me to sort of see the big picture of what the weather was doing. So it legitimizes the idea of sort of extrapolating weather data from one location to another, because we know how the weather tends to operate during the summer, and Washington, D.C. is warmer by a few degrees.
Right.
And so you can make some reasonable assumptions, and that's what we did. We blended official weather observations with this reconstruction system where I could draw maps. And then Jeff compiled 450 pages of a Word document filled with quotes from the soldiers and from citizens that told us more about the weather, what they were feeling at the ground. So you blend all this stuff together and you begin to put a story together.
There was a term that you mentioned in the talk called, now I forget what it is, the sun temperature. Is that right? The sun temperature. And this is fascinating, and I'm jumping ahead because this is particularly pertinent, I think, if you're thinking about the men prior to Pickett's charge, and I think you make this point, the Confederates especially, but all of them really, I guess, who are laying down on the ground. What is sun temperature? And I've never heard of this before, but I'm fascinated by this idea. And it's true, I've noticed in the summer when I've laid down on the ground, it seems hotter than when I'm standing up. So go ahead. Tell us what sun temperature is.
Well, I'll give you this one quickly. I want to make sure Jeff has a chance because he always provides the perspective that I don't. But
Yeah.
The observers at the Naval Observatory also had a special thermometer out in the sun.
As Addressing Gettysburg celebrates its 8th year bringing Gettysburg to you in unique and creative ways, we want to take this moment to thank our patrons. The only reason we've been able to last this long is because our patrons have supported our efforts since 2019. And we could do a lot more if you join the ranks of the original Gettys nerds by going to patreon.com/addressinggettysburg. Oh, and you can listen to the rest of this episode over there.